In exactly 3 years, the fourth prince is scheduled for execution. I know the date, I know the executioner, and I know the exact words of the decree. My name was Ethan Carter, a 29-year-old historian who died protecting a secret journal. And now, I am the prince whose death was supposed to be a footnote in history. But history is a river, and I'm about to change its course. Let me tell you about the last night I was myself. It was 11:47 p.m. The archive smelled the way old paper always does, like time compressed into something you could almost taste. I had been working for 6 hours on a bronze box the size of a shoebox, its surface oxidized green except for the seams, which were suspiciously clean for something allegedly 800 years old. I had my notes spread across half the table, a cold cup of coffee I'd forgotten about, and the particular kind of tunnel vision that only hits you when you know you're standing at the edge of something real. The box had come through a private collector's estate. No provenance, no documentation. The university's authentication team had dated it to the Zhou period, which already made no sense because the Zhou Empire wasn't supposed to have a period. It existed in historical records the way ghost ships exist in sailors' tales. Too specific to be invented, too impossible to be real. I had spent 4 years on the Zhou question. My dissertation committee thought I was wasting time on a fringe obsession. They weren't entirely wrong. No peer-reviewed paper accepted the Zhou records as legitimate. No archaeological dig had confirmed the territory. The texts appeared in the historical record like something had been quietly inserted into the gap between two dynasties and then forgotten so closely that the gap itself closed up around them. But the texts were too internally consistent to be forgeries. Forgeries make mistakes. They rely on the forger's assumptions about how things worked, and those assumptions always show. These texts had the grain of real bureaucratic life in them. The tedious repetition of grain tallies, the specific weight measurements, the way certain magistrates were always referred to with slightly incorrect honorifics that only made sense if you knew they had been stripped of half their titles and the record keeper was too afraid to acknowledge it formally. You don't invent that kind of detail. You live through it. I was the only historian who had read all of it. 4 years of that kind of reading doesn't leave room for much else. The journal was inside the box's false bottom. I found it when the outer shell cracked under my attempts to open the corroded latch, a thin damage to the bronze I hadn't intended, and the compartment revealed itself. The journal was wrapped in oiled cloth that had done its job for God knows how long, and the pages were fragile but legible. The calligraphy was the Zhou court's style I knew well enough to read without a reference text. It was the fourth prince's handwriting. I knew it because I had seen fragments of it before in a border notation attached to one of the agricultural records. The same stroke pressure, the same habit of squaring the character for day in a way that wasn't standard practice. It's the kind of thing that sounds like academic obsession until you realize that handwriting is one of the few things people can't disguise when they're not thinking about it. The journal's final page had a single, unfinished sentence. If only someone had known the truth. I didn't finish reading it. The fire started somewhere in the building's east wing. I know that now. At the time, all I knew was smoke, and then heat, and then the specific horror of watching irreplaceable paper beginning to curl at the edges. I had the journal in my hands. The rational decision was to put it down and leave. I am the first to admit I am not always a rational man about books. I made it halfway to the exit. The last thing I felt wasn't heat. It was cold, a specific, biting cold radiating from the journal's cover, as if the bronze box had already claimed something from me and was simply finishing the transaction. Then nothing. Then I woke up in a body that wasn't mine, with a headache that could split stone, staring at the underside of an embroidered canopy that cost more than my annual salary. The first thing I did was not panic. This is not because I'm brave, it's because panic is physiologically expensive and I had more important things to do with whatever adrenaline this borrowed body had available. I lay still and took inventory. The ceiling was right. The embroidery pattern was the Zhao court's fourth-rank floral arrangement. I had seen it in the illustrated courtly manual that had been smuggled out of the alleged dynasty's records. The incense smelled right, sandalwood mixed with something I recognized as the specific resin blend mentioned in a domestic accounts ledger from year 14 of the Tianxi Emperor's reign. The sounds outside the door were the shuffling of palace servants moving at a pace designed to be unobtrusive. I sat up slowly. The body was thinner than mine, taller. My hands, his hands, a distinction I dropped almost immediately because the possessive was already a problem, were ink-stained in the specific way of someone who wrote a great deal but didn't practice calligraphy for pleasure. A habit of the left third finger catching the brush wrong. I recognized that too. I had noted it in the border notation. I was the fourth prince. His name was Zhao Liu Yuan. He was 26 years old, the fourth of 7 imperial sons. His mother died of fever when he was 9. His palace allocation in the northeast wing of the compound, where the buildings were oldest and the maintenance most neglected. He had no military rank and no ministerial backing. He existed in the imperial record primarily as a space between more important names. In 3 years, he would be dead. The execution decree was 22 words. I had translated them myself for a footnote in my dissertation. Charged with consorting with border rebels, sentenced to immediate beheading. The 7th prince had signed the decree, as emperor, 4 months after his ascension. I should be precise about what that meant. Not for drama, for strategy. It meant I had 3 years before the situation became irreversible. It meant the 7th prince was not yet emperor. He was currently 16 and politically irrelevant, which is exactly how the most dangerous people always looked before they mattered. It meant the crown prince was the current favorite for succession, the 3rd prince was running his own quiet campaign, and the 5th prince was making enough noise to keep everyone's attention while he made money off war contracts. And none of them were paying attention to the 4th prince. That was, historically speaking, their first mistake. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up carefully. The body's balance was mine to manage now, which meant learning its particular center of gravity the way you learn a new word. Use it wrong a few times before it sits right. I crossed to the window. The courtyard below was the northeast corner of the palace. Correct. The particular arrangement of stones in the paving, 3 large flat pieces flush with the ground, one raised slightly on the eastern edge from where a tree root had pushed up under it. I had read about that paving in a construction dispute record. A stonemason had argued about payment. I knew that paving stone better than I had ever seen it. I exhaled. It was real. Here is what historians understand that other people don't. The past is not a story. Stories have narrative logic, cause and effect, protagonists and antagonists, lessons that accumulate into meaning. The past is a system. Systems have pressures, and pressures have predictable release points. And if you know where the release points are, you can either brace for them or redirect them. I had spent 4 years mapping every release point in the Zhao Empire's final century. The question was how to use that map without tearing the territory apart. The first servant who came to dress me was a girl of about 15 with careful eyes and overly steady hands. Overly steady because she was watching me for something wrong. Servants watch for wrong things the same way historians do. They know the baseline intimately, and deviation from the baseline is information. I gave her nothing to work with. I knew the court speech because I had spent a decade translating documents in it, not textbook Zhao, the actual spoken register of the palace, which differed from the written register the same way spoken English differs from the text of a legal contract. Condensed. More particles, specific honorifics that shifted based on the relative status of the speaker and the spoken to, with 4 distinct registers for addressing superiors versus equals versus inferiors versus servants who had been with the household long enough to warrant a specific intermediate category. I had practiced this speech alone in my university office at odd hours because understanding a language and being able to use it correctly under pressure are not the same skill. I had translated the court manual so thoroughly that I could recite the correct seasonal greeting for each rank of official from memory. My colleagues thought I was eccentric. They were correct. The result was that when I spoke to the servant girl, I addressed her correctly, in the precise intermediate register appropriate to a household servant of more than 5 years' tenure. Her hands didn't stop, but something shifted in her posture. A reduction of tension that told me she had been expecting something different and found the familiar instead. Small data point. Filed. I ate the morning meal that was brought to me without incident. The food was correct for the period, the season, and the fourth prince's dietary records, which I had cross-referenced in a supply ledger. Not because I had been planning this, because the supply ledgers were where you found the honest history. Not the official records, which were written for posterity, but the daily accounts, which were written for the steward and didn't care about appearances. After eating, I did what I calculated was the most important thing I could do in the first 24 hours. Nothing. I sat in the study and read. I let the servants move around me. I accepted the minor correspondence that came through official channels and responded to each piece in the fourth prince's handwriting, which I had reverse engineered from his journal entries and border notations over 2 years of analysis. I did not initiate anything. I did not seek audiences. I did not do anything that would create a data point that didn't exist in the historical record of what the fourth prince did on this specific week in year 22 of the TNZ reign. I needed to understand what I had walked into before I moved a single piece. History is a river. I knew that better than anyone. Move one stone and the current shifts, and you don't always get to see where it goes before someone downstream drowns. Every change I made was a variable I had to track. The fewer changes I made, the more stable my map remained, and I needed that map. It was the only advantage I had. The fourth prince was supposed to spend this week unwell and confined to his rooms. The historical record contained a physician's note about a winter fever. I replicated the fever's behavioral symptoms: reduced activity, early retirement, minimal food consumption noted by the kitchen, and used the 3 days of acceptable isolation to read everything in the study. The fourth prince had been careful. His own journal, not the one I had found in the bronze box, which didn't exist yet in this timeline, was written in a second layer of cipher over the court calligraphy, substituting characters by their phonetic component rather than their meaning. An amateur cipher, but effective against anyone who hadn't spent 4 years with the original documents. I read the current journal in an afternoon. He had known something was wrong with the succession situation. He hadn't known what to do about it. I did. On the 4th day, I was recovered enough to resume light activity. A minister sent a petition for an audience, one of the third prince's network, testing whether the fourth prince had formed any new alliances during his illness. The minister's name was Chen Weibo. I knew Chen Weibo well. He appeared in 12 separate historical documents, always slightly to the left of the main action, always positioned to benefit from someone else's downfall. He would, in 4 years, be executed for accepting bribes from the fifth prince's war contractor network. He was good at surviving, which meant he was good at identifying threats early. He thought the fourth prince might be developing into one. He wasn't wrong. I did not grant the audience. I sent a written response that was conciliatory, deferential to the third prince's known priorities, and completely uninteresting. It read like a man who knew his place and had no designs on anything beyond his own quiet comfort. The exact persona the fourth prince had cultivated for protection for years. I was going to use that persona the same way you use camouflage, not because I was harmless, because the most useful weapons are the ones no one is watching. Chen Weibo's response came 2 days later, a small gift of winter fruit, the standard courtesy that said, "Received, noted, not a threat." He moved his attention elsewhere. Test passed. Then the harder test arrived. One of the fourth prince's household servants, not the girl with careful eyes, a different one, a man in his 30s who had been assigned to the household 3 months ago, was making careful notes about when I left my rooms, when I received correspondence, and which direction I faced during the morning ritual exercise. I noticed on day 2. I waited. On day 6, he attempted to access the study after I'd retired for the night. I was not in the bed. I was in the study, in the dark, because I had read enough about the palace's guard rotation schedule to know the eastern corridor was unwatched for exactly 40 minutes after the third night bell. I was reading. When he came through the door, I was already looking at him. I said, very quietly, in the servant register, "Steward Liu mentioned last week that the west storage room needs inventory. I suggest you complete it before morning." He left without a word. I did not report him. I did not confront him again. I simply ensured that for the following 2 weeks there was nothing in the study worth finding, while also making one careful note in a ledger that I left accessible. A column of dates and activities that were entirely routine and yet looked to a suspicious eye like they might be in code. They weren't, but the man wasted 3 weeks trying to decode them. I used those 3 weeks to do the actual work. He arrived on an afternoon in the 11th month when the palace compound was still and cold, and I was reviewing a map of the northern border territories I'd drawn from memory. Shen Yan. I knew more about him than he would have liked, and I had been managing my response to that knowledge since I'd confirmed what week it was and calculated when our paths would first cross. In the historical record, Shen Yan requested an audience with the fourth prince once in the 4th month of year 22, exactly this period. The record listed the meeting as brief. The fourth prince's household ledger showed a gift of wine sent afterward, the standard courtesy of insignificance. The meeting had been inconsequential. I intended to change that, carefully, in ways that wouldn't show up as a change from outside. He came in with the posture of a man who'd decided everything about the room before crossing the threshold. I had been expecting that. Shen Yan's tactical assessments were legendary in the military records. Not the official hagiographies, which described him as loyal and brilliant, but the actual campaign accounts written by junior officers who'd served under him, where the picture was of someone who processed information constantly and automatically, and never entirely relaxed his assessment of any situation. He was 27. He looked younger in person than the one portrait that survived into the historical record, which had been painted after a major campaign and reflected the specific tiredness of extended command. This version of him was still at the start of something. I stood when he entered, correctly, by rank. He said, "The fourth prince's health has improved." Not a question, an assessment. I said, "Enough for this," and gestured to the chair. He sat with the economy of a man who'd learned not to waste movement. He looked at the map on my desk. I watched him register what the map was. I watched the register turn into a question he didn't ask. I said, "It's the Yanmen Pass region, the floodplain east of the garrison." He said, "I'm familiar with it." "You will be more familiar with it in spring," I said, "when the secondary channel overflows. It's been backing up for 2 seasons. The silt deposit from the upstream dams is about 3 times the standard accumulation rate. The garrison's drainage system wasn't built for it." Silence. "The garrison will need to relocate their southern supply depot before the thaw," I said. "Otherwise it floods. They lose 2 months of provisions, and the eastern road becomes impassable for the critical supply window." Shen Yan looked at me the way I looked at the bronze box that last night, with the particular attention you give something that doesn't add up yet. He said, "How do you know the silt accumulation rate?" I said, "I read the water management reports from the past 8 years. They're in the Northern Infrastructure files. The Bureau of Works submits them annually. No one reads them." More silence. "I read most things no one reads. It's a habit." He left without committing to anything. The gift of wine went with him anyway, because the ledger needed to show a normal meeting. 3 months later, the flood happened exactly as I'd described. The garrison's southern supply depot was untouched. Someone had moved it in the 3rd week of the 2nd month, quietly, on an informal authorization that wouldn't appear in the official record until the annual accounts were compiled. I noted the data point and kept moving. Shen Yan began investigating me with the thoroughness of a man who had encountered something that didn't fit his map and couldn't rest until it did. This was both useful and a problem. The useful part, he was gathering information, which meant he was engaged, which meant I had a vector for influence I could work with carefully. The problem, Shen Yan was not easy to manage. His network extended through the Imperial Guard into the Bureau of Revenue, the Ministry of Rights, and at least 2 of the other princes' households. If he decided I was a threat, the whisper he'd send out would be quiet, but it would travel to the right ears. And he was suspicious of me in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. He showed up to a second audience 2 months after the first one. He'd asked for it himself, which was unusual enough to confirm he was working something out. He came in with the same posture and the same economy of movement, but there was a layer of specific attention this time that hadn't been there before. He said, after a normal enough opening exchange, "The fourth prince has been studying the Northern Territories." "The fourth prince studies many things," I said. "Unusual things," he said. "The Bureau of Works records, the agricultural census from the northern prefectures, the water management files going back 11 years, the garrison transfer records." I looked at him. "You've been thorough." "It's my job to be thorough," he said. "What I haven't determined yet is whether the fourth prince is conducting his own analysis or whether someone is supplying the questions." There it was. He didn't think I was dangerous because I was ambitious. He thought I was a conduit, an asset, someone from a rival power using the prince's body as a vehicle for intelligence gathering. That was, in its own way, almost logical. I said, "Sit down, Commander." He stayed standing. I said, "I'll tell you something I've told no one. Not because I trust you, because you're going to investigate until you find something that looks like an answer, and I'd prefer you find the actual one." He sat. "The Great Zhao Empire has 143 years of recorded history available in its own archives," I said. 40 of those years are extensively documented. The rest, including the current reign, are being lived in real time, which means the record is still being written. Most people in this palace are living inside the story without reading it. I read the story." "From where?" he said. "From the parts that no one bothers with," I said. "The infrastructure reports, the supply ledgers, the water management surveys, the grain census, the records that exist for purely functional reasons and therefore haven't been altered to flatter anyone or support any particular political narrative. The truth tends to live in the places no one is performing for." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You predicted the Yanmen flood." "I read 8 years of silt data and did the calculation." "You predicted Minister Zhao's appointment to the Revenue Bureau 3 weeks before the Emperor announced it." "I had. I'd mentioned it offhandedly to a household official in a way that would be noted. The Emperor had been consulting with the Grand Secretary about revenue shortfalls for 6 months. Zhao was the only candidate with both the technical knowledge and the political neutrality to survive confirmation. It wasn't prediction, it was pattern recognition. You know the third prince's cipher." I hadn't known I'd used it. I went back through the last 2 months of my own behavior and found the moment. I had sent a routine note to a Ministry of Rights official using a particular formal structure that happened to echo the third prince's personal code, which I knew because I'd studied it in recovered documents. It was an accident of too much knowledge expressing itself unconsciously. I've studied codes as a scholarly interest. I recognize patterns. Shen Yan looked at me with the expression of a man who had been expecting a simpler explanation and found something more interesting instead. "The fourth prince," he said slowly, "has never demonstrated any of this before." "The fourth prince had no reason to," I said. "A neglected prince who displays unusual knowledge gets noticed. Getting noticed in this palace without the right backing gets you killed." "And now?" "Now I've calculated that being noticed by the right person carefully is less dangerous than the alternative." Another silence. Longer. "Why me?" he said. I looked at him. I let the pause hold. "Because," I said, "you are going to help put the 7th prince on the throne, and I know what happens to you afterward. And I'd like, if it's possible, to show you a different path before you commit to that one." The room went very still. I watched his hand move toward the knife at his belt. Stop. Return to his knee. "That," he said carefully, "is treasonous." "Only if the 7th prince wins," I said. Here is the thing about revenge that most people get wrong. They think it requires force. It doesn't. Force leaves marks. Force requires energy, creates witnesses, generates records. Force is visible, and visible things can be countered. What I was doing didn't look like anything. The Crown Prince had a problem with pride. He made decisions in public that he would not make in private because he was always performing for an audience. His image of himself as a decisive future emperor required him to respond to challenges with the kind of swift, unambiguous authority that emperors display in approved historical accounts. Real emperors, the ones I'd studied, were more calculating than that, but the Crown Prince had only read the approved accounts. I knew from the historical record that the Crown Prince's downfall was precipitated by a border negotiation he handled badly. He overplayed his hand with the northern tribal envoy because he was performing decisive strength instead of actually reading the negotiation situation. The envoy left insulted. The border situation deteriorated. The emperor lost confidence in the Crown Prince's judgment. It was a shift that had taken 11 months to fully register in the court, and by the time the Crown Prince understood what had happened, he'd already lost the emperor's backing. In the original timeline, this happened on its own. The Crown Prince did it to himself because that was his nature. All I did was make sure the tribal envoy's visit was slightly more public than it would have otherwise have been. A word to a Ministry of Rights official about the appropriate ceremonial protocols for a northern envoy. Technically correct, historically grounded, absolutely the right way to handle the visit if you wanted to honor the envoy's cultural expectations. And suddenly, the Crown Prince's performance was happening in front of a larger audience, more witnesses to the overplay. The implications traveled faster. I said nothing that was false. I suggested nothing that was inappropriate. I simply ensured that an event that was going to happen had more observers than it would have had otherwise. The Crown Prince began losing ground in the emperor's estimation 2 weeks ahead of the original schedule. The third prince was more careful. He'd built his position on information, not spectacle. He ran the most sophisticated intelligence operation of any of the princes, which I knew because the records of his network survived the dynasty and were preserved, incorrectly attributed but preserved, in 2 separate academic collections I had spent a year analyzing. His weakness was paranoia. He trusted no one and verified everything, which meant he was constantly receiving incomplete information filtered through too many layers of suspicion. He couldn't distinguish between a genuine threat and a manufactured one because he treated both as equally real until proven otherwise. I leaked something to him, not true information. I was careful about that because true information can be traced back to its source. What I gave him was a pattern, a series of small, unconnected things that, when assembled by a paranoid intelligence operation, looked like evidence of a coordinated plot by the fifth prince to undermine the third prince's northern alliances. The fifth prince was not plotting against the third prince's northern alliances. He was making money off war contracts in the south and had no particular interest in the north at all. But the pattern looked convincing if you were already looking for threats and already didn't trust the fifth prince. The third prince began moving against the fifth prince's interests in the northern trade routes. The fifth prince noticed and pushed back. Both of them redirected resources from the succession contest into a proxy conflict that benefited neither of them and cost both of them standing with the emperor. I didn't write any of the letters that were exchanged. I didn't forge any documents. I simply made sure that 2 true but innocuous pieces of information, which happened to be in different locations in the administrative record, were each brought to the third prince's attention in the same month by different routes. His own machinery did the rest. The seventh prince, who was the real threat, who would eventually win, was still too young and too underestimated to be worth directly engaging. I was watching him, waiting for the moment when he would begin to consolidate, because that was when he would need to be redirected toward a different set of supporters than the ones history had given him. That moment hadn't come yet. He came back 4 times over the following 6 months. Not always for audiences, sometimes it was incidental, the natural overlap of his guard inspection routes with the Northeast compound. I understood what he was doing. He was continuing to gather data points. The difference was that now he was comparing what I told him against what he independently confirmed, and the confirmations kept arriving. The flood in the Yanmen Plain I'd mentioned 3 months before his second visit had developed exactly as I'd described. The ministerial appointment I'd noted in passing had occurred. 2 of the Crown Prince's court maneuvers had failed in the specific ways I predicted they would fail. He was a man who trusted data over intuition. The data was accumulating in one direction. In the 7th month, he came in the evening, not an official audience. He arrived through the servants' gate, which told me he'd done this without logging it through the official guard records. I was in the study. He sat across from me without invitation. He said, "The flood in the Yanmen Plain. I've been looking at the engineering records. No one in the Bureau of Works identified that risk. Their senior engineer filed his annual assessment without noting the silt problem. Their senior engineer has been in the same post for 15 years. He stopped looking carefully around year 8. You've never worked in infrastructure assessment?"
No.
"So how?" "I told you," I said. "I read everything." He looked at me for a long time. "The 4th Prince," he said, "is not the same man I spoke with last year." He wasn't wrong. He just had the causality backwards. "People change," I said. "Not like this." He leaned forward slightly. "I've questioned 6 people in your household who have served for more than 3 years. 2 of them noted that your calligraphy improved significantly in the 12th month of last year. Your brushwork, the pressure changes. One of them has served in 4 separate noble households and says she's never seen anyone's calligraphy change that fundamentally after the age of 20. The servant girl with the careful eyes. "Of course." "I had a fever," I said. "For 3 days," he said. "A significant fever." He was still looking at me, not accusing, mapping. "There's something else," he said. "The cipher you used in the note to Ministry official Dao last winter, it's not the 3rd Prince's cipher. I had it analyzed. The structure is similar, but the substitution logic is different. It's a variant I haven't seen before. My analysts don't recognize the source." I had been less careful than I thought. "Where did you learn it?" he said. The honest answer was, from documents that don't exist in this timeline, from a journal that hasn't been written yet, in a university archive that won't be built for 300 years. I said, "From the 4th Prince's private study materials." He said, "I've inventoried the study." "Not all of it." Silence. "I need you to trust me, not because I've given you a reason to, but because the alternative, you investigating until you find something that genuinely doesn't fit, puts us both in a position I'd prefer to avoid." "What position?" "The one where you have to decide what to do with information that has no good explanation." He was quiet. Then, "Give me a reason." "In the 4th month of next year, the Emperor will receive a petition from the Northern Prefectural Governor about a new taxation structure. The petition will be supported by the Crown Prince. The 3rd Prince will oppose it. The Emperor will defer the decision for 30 days and then approve it. The petition's actual purpose is to redirect funds from the Northern Grain Reserve into the Crown Prince's military account, disguised as infrastructure investment. The Northern Grain Reserve will run short the following winter. There will be famine in the 3 northernmost prefectures." Shen Yan's face did something careful and controlled. "That's a specific prediction," he said. "I will have it exactly as I've described," I said. "You'll know in 4 months. After that, I'd like to have a more detailed conversation about what comes next." He stood. "And if it doesn't happen," he said, "then you'll have one more data point," I said, "and you can decide accordingly." He left. 4 months later, the petition arrived. I want to be honest about something. The butterfly effect wasn't an abstract concern for me. It was a constant, grinding weight behind every calculation I made. Because every time I changed something, and I was changing things, small things but accumulating, the map I carried in my head became less accurate. The original timeline had a particular shape. The famine I'd predicted would happen regardless of my intervention. I hadn't changed the petition, I'd just informed Shen Yan about it so he could make his own calculation about where his loyalties lay. The Crown Prince's overreach at the Northern Tribal negotiation was something I'd accelerated slightly but not caused. The Third Prince and Fifth Prince's proxy conflict was something I'd catalyzed from existing tensions rather than invented. But every catalyzed event changed the timeline's texture. The Third Prince had moved against the Fifth Prince's northern interests 2 months earlier than the historical record showed, which meant the Fifth Prince's counter-response was happening earlier, which meant the Emperor was seeing the conflict earlier, which meant his patience with both of them was depleting on a different schedule than the one I knew. How much did schedule changes matter? I didn't know. That was the honest answer. I knew the endpoints. I knew which events were historically inevitable in the sense that they arose from deep systemic pressures rather than individual decisions, and those endpoints were probably still coming, but the path to them was shifting under my feet every time I moved, and I couldn't always see where the shifted path led. The famine was coming regardless. The Northern Grain Reserve had been systematically undermined by fiscal manipulation for 3 years before this petition. The petition was just the last piece. That was systemic. I hadn't changed the system. But the fact that Shen Yan now knew about the famine before it happened meant he was going to do something about it. Quietly, through the guard networks he controlled, in ways that wouldn't appear in the official record. He was going to move grain. Not enough to prevent the famine entirely, he didn't have that kind of authority, but enough to reduce deaths in the 2 prefectures where he had personal connections through former military colleagues. Which meant the famine's death toll would be lower than the historical record showed, which meant the Emperor's political response to the famine would be calibrated to a different severity of disaster, which meant the subsequent reshuffling of northern prefectural governments would favor different candidates. I spent 3 nights recalculating. The cascade was manageable. That was my conclusion. The fundamental trajectory of the succession crisis was unchanged. The Crown Prince would continue to lose standing, the 7th Prince would continue to consolidate quietly, the Emperor's health would continue to decline on the schedule his physician's notes described. The small changes I was making were changing the human cost of certain events without changing the political outcomes. That was, I decided, acceptable. More than acceptable. It was the reason I was doing this at all. Here is the thing about being a historian who ends up inside the history. You understand, in a way that was previously only theoretical, that the bodies in the historical record were real. The famine deaths were real. The people who died in the succession war were real. I had processed those numbers as data points for 4 years. Standing inside them, knowing which ones were preventable and which ones weren't, was different from processing them as data points. I couldn't stop the river, but I could move a few people out of the current's worst path. As long as I was careful, as long as I tracked every stone I moved and calculated the downstream shift, as long as I didn't lose the map. By the end of year 23, the court looked like this. The Crown Prince had lost 2 key ministerial supporters to the internal conflict with the Third Prince. He had not yet lost the Emperor's public backing, but the Emperor's private correspondence, which I knew the contents of because I'd analyzed a collection of recovered imperial letters that had been preserved as historical artifacts in 3 separate collections, showed increasing frustration with the Crown Prince's strategic judgment. The Third Prince had spent significant resources fighting a proxy conflict with the Fifth Prince and was beginning to realize he'd been maneuvered. He was pulling back and recalculating. His intelligence operation had identified me as a variable of some interest, which meant Chen Weibo had been feeding him reports, which meant I needed to be more careful about what those reports said. I arranged for the reports to say that the Fourth Prince was developing an unexpected scholarly interest in military history and an unusual friendship with the commander of the Imperial Guard. Both true, both interpretable as either political amateur hour or something more serious, depending on what lens the third prince chose to use. He chose the first interpretation. I had calibrated the visible evidence to make it look like the fourth prince was trying to make a single court ally and landed on the most accessible military connection available. Transparent, low stakes, not worth worrying about. The fifth prince was angry and spending money on it, which was historically consistent. The seventh prince was 16 and running a very effective shadow campaign through an older mentor whose name I recognized, one Minister Wu, who had been the real architect of the seventh prince's eventual ascension. In the original timeline, Minister Wu's role hadn't been identified until after the fact, when historians analyzed the political correspondence record. I had identified it already, which put me ahead of every other player on the board. I was not moving against the seventh prince yet. I was watching Minister Wu. Specifically, I was watching for the moment when Minister Wu would make his first significant recruitment, the military officer who would eventually become the seventh prince's chief tactical asset, the one who would, in the original timeline, be the person to sign the execution warrant for the fourth prince. When Minister Wu made that recruitment, I would know the succession timeline was entering its final phase. That would be the moment to act. I had, by conservative estimate, 18 months. Shen Yan came to the study more regularly now. He no longer came through the servants' gate. He came officially as the commander conducting routine oversight of the Northeast Compound's guard allocation. The official record showed nothing unusual. In the study, we talked. He told me things about the military situation that confirmed details I'd already known from the historical record and added texture I hadn't had. I told him things about the political situation that he confirmed through his own networks. We were, without either of us naming it, operating as a shared intelligence system. He said, one evening, "You never ask for anything." "I ask for things constantly," I said. "I asked you last month to review the garrison rotation schedule." "You asked me to look at something that benefited the garrison and cost you nothing," he said. "I mean, you never ask for anything that benefits you directly." I thought about how to answer that honestly without saying something true that would sound insane. I'm building towards something. The individual benefits aren't the point. What is the point? Survival, I said. Specifically, mine. More generally, everyone's where preventable. He looked at me with the expression I'd learned to recognize as his working something out face. You know how this ends. Not a question. I know how it was going to end, I said. Whether I've changed it enough is something I won't know until it happens. That's not reassuring. I know. He was quiet for a while. Then, the portrait in the Eastern Gallery, the one the palace steward catalogued as a Zhao period landscape with court figures. Something in my chest did something complicated. What about it? I said. It's been looking at it, he said. There's a man in the background, standing apart from the other court figures. He's dressed wrong for the period. The collar is wrong. The fabric doesn't have the correct layered structure. And he's holding something the court artist wouldn't have had a reason to invent. Silence. What is he holding? I said. I don't know what to call it, Shen then said. It's a flat card attached to a cord. There's text on it in a script I don't recognize. And the man's face. He stopped. I know whose face it is. We stood in front of it together at midnight, with one lamp between us. The portrait was large, 2 meters wide, a formal landscape with court figures gathered in the foreground for what appeared to be a seasonal ceremony. I had been in this gallery before. I had walked past this painting a dozen times. I had not looked at the background figures carefully because I had been managing too many other calculations. I should have looked more carefully. He was there, in the right edge of the background, slightly obscured by a ceremonial pillar, partially overlapping with a court official in correct period dress. The figure's clothing was wrong in the way Xin Yun had described. Modern cut, modern collar, a fit that had nothing to do with the layered formal courtwear of the Zhao period. brown hair, pale eyes that the artist had rendered in a blue-gray that must have seemed like an unusual creative choice to any viewer who didn't know what they were looking at. And around his neck, on a cord that the artist had rendered with careful detail, a flat card with text printed in a sans-serif typeface that would not exist for 300 years. My university ID, my name, my faculty department, my photograph on the card, rendered small but unmistakable by a painter who had clearly seen the original or something close to it. I stared at it for a long time. In the corner of the card, visible if you knew to look for it, was something the painter had added either because they were compulsive about detail or because they had understood that the detail mattered. The university's logo, simplified into 4 brush strokes that nonetheless preserved the essential shape. The painting's date, recorded in the catalog, was year 14 of a reign that predated the Zhou Empire's founding by 280 years. Someone had painted me here before the dynasty I was standing in had existed. Someone had known I was coming 300 years before I arrived. I said very quietly, "How long have you had this?" "I noticed it 6 weeks ago. I've been deciding what to do with it." "And?" "I don't know yet," he said. "What I know is that the man in this painting is not the fourth prince. The fourth prince doesn't have brown hair and blue eyes, and the man in this painting is wearing something around his neck that no one in this court, in this dynasty, or in any dynasty I've ever studied has an explanation for." I looked at the card, my name in crisp modern print. "But you do," he said, "don't you?" I thought about what the fourth prince's journal had said, the one that existed now, the one I had been reading since I arrived. If only someone had known the truth. He'd known something. Maybe not the same thing I knew, but something. "The journal," I said. "The one the fourth prince kept in cipher. You've read it." A pause. "Parts of it. After the cipher analysis. The last entry." Another pause, longer. "He knew someone was coming," Shenyang said. "He wrote that he'd seen something in the Eastern Gallery, a figure in an old painting. He wrote that it looked like it was meant to be a message." I looked at the painting. Someone had sent this forward through 300 years of history. Not a letter. Letters get lost, get destroyed, get mistranslated. A portrait, hidden in the background of a formal court scene, detailed enough to be unmistakable if you knew what you were looking at, anonymous enough to survive 3 centuries without being understood. The bronze box had been a soul trap. The journal had been the anchor. But this had been a signal, planted in the historical record for me to find, because someone had known I would be here to find it. Which meant someone had done this before, or someone had known this would happen before it happened, or... The calculations I was running started fraying at the edges because the premise I had been operating on, that I was an accident of history, a side effect of a fire and an artifact, was starting to look like something else entirely. "Shenyang," I said. "Yes." "I need to tell you something that will not make sense." "Most things you say don't make sense," he said. "Tell me anyway." I looked at the painting one more time. My face, rendered in Zhou court pigments by an artist who had been dead for 3 centuries. My name on a card in a font that wouldn't be designed for hundreds of years. Someone had put me here, and I didn't know why. "The river," I said. "I've been thinking of it as something I was managing, something I was navigating. And now? Now I'm wondering if I'm the water, and someone else has been doing the navigating." The lamp flickered. In the painting, the figure with the university ID and the modern collar stood at the edge of the court gathering, slightly apart, looking outward with an expression the artist had captured with more accuracy than they could have possibly had reason to. Not quite belonging, not quite a stranger, watching the scene with the particular attention of someone who already knew how it ended. I had been managing the history of the great Zhou Empire for 14 months. The question I had not asked yet, the question that had been sitting in the bronze box and the journal and 300 years of careful pigment, was who had been managing me. The end.